Module 18, Chapter 28. In this chapter, we'll be talking about the female aspects of the reproductive system. We'll be focusing in on the functions of the ovaries, two paired glands in the pelvic cavity, responsible for the production of gametes and hormones. So let's begin by talking about oogenesis. Oogenesis has many differences from spermatogenesis. One being that oogenesis actually begins prior to birth, in the fetal ovary. It then pauses during fetal development and stays silent until it is triggered to complete, beginning at puberty and ending at menopause. So if you're going to describe the steps of oogenesis, you have to actually begin in the fetus. In the fetal ovary, there are oogonia, diploid stem cells, that begin to divide and rapidly and produce millions of germ cells. These diploid germ cells don't survive long. In fact, most undergo atresia, which is cell death. However, there are some that do survive, and these few become your primary oocytes, which are diploid. The primary oocytes within the fetal ovary actually begin meiosis I. However, they enter what is called stasis prior to completion. I always view stasis as suspended animation. I'm big on the sci-fi movies. I've also had students who just view stasis as sleeping. So you could say these primary oocytes begin meiosis I, but fall asleep before completing it. And these primary oocytes stay in stasis. They stay sleeping until puberty. Now, these sleeping primary oocytes are found within structures called primordial ovarian follicles. At birth, there are only about 2 million of these primordial ovarian follicles within the ovary. By puberty, there's only about 200,000 left, so they continue to die as the female ages. After puberty, and then continuing into menopause, follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone stimulate about 24 ovarian follicles to continue developing each month. Now, even though 24 are woken up, monthly, one primary oocyte completes meiosis I. When it completes meiosis I, as you can see from the top of the figure, you will form two cells. One cell is called the secondary oocyte, the other is called a polar body. Both the polar body and the secondary oocyte are haploid, so each contains 23 chromosomes. However, if you look at these two cells, do you notice something very different from spermatogenesis? Recall, in spermatogenesis, one primary spermatocyte formed two equal-sized secondary oocytes. That's not what you have here. What you have in females is unequal cell division, meaning one cell gets all of the cytoplasm and the other gets very, very little. The secondary oocyte is the cell receiving all the cytoplasm. The polar body, for the most part, is just discarded nuclear material. It has no function. In fact, it'll become degraded by the ovary over time. The secondary oocyte then begins meiosis II. However, as it's proceeding through meiosis II, it enters stasis again. The secondary oocyte basically falls asleep. And it is this sleeping secondary oocyte that is actually ovulated from the ovary each month. The secondary oocyte only wakes up and completes meiosis II if it is fertilized first. So let's pose the scenario where it has become fertilized. This secondary oocyte is stimulated to finish meiosis II with the act of fertilization. During meiosis II, the secondary spermatocyte forms two cells. One is another polar body, which is more discarded nuclear material. The other cell is your haploid ovum. Fertilization is then complete when the sperm nucleus joins the ovum nucleus to form a diploid nucleus within your new zygote. If fertilization doesn't occur, the secondary oocyte passes through the female reproductive tract, it dies, and it's actually expelled from the female with vaginal secretions. Now let's talk about folliculogenesis, which is the development of follicles within the ovary. Please note that there are a few mistakes in the writing of this particular section in the lecture textbook. My work husband and I actually wrote to Ken, and he had some people who had pointed out these errors when they did their reviews of this edition of the book. So his new edition of the book, which is due out next spring, is actually going to have everything corrected. So please follow what's in the lecture notes and in this PowerPoint. And if you see a discrepancy with the lecture book with regards to timing or dates, those are the errors in the lecture book. All right, so when you start thinking about folliculogenesis, it's going to begin with your primordial follicles. Your primordial follicles are primary oocytes that are in stasis. So these are those little sleeping primary oocytes surrounded by one layer of follicular cells and a basement membrane. All of your primordial follicles that you will ever have for your entire reproductive lifetime form between 6 to 9 months of fetal development. What this implies is that females have a limited number of, quote, eggs, which is very different from males who can produce new sperm throughout their lifetime. The primordial follicles constitute about 90 to 95% of all the follicles in an adult ovary. Now, primordial follicles are going to undergo a process called recruitment. And in recruitment, about 24 primordial follicles are going to be stimulated to wake up and actually undergo a 290-day developmental journey, out of which only one on average in each cohort will actually ovulate. The rest of the follicles within that cohort are going to die along the journey. The primordial follicles are going to transition into primary ovarian follicles. Primary ovarian follicles contain a primary oocyte that is out of stasis, so that means it is active, surrounded by a single layer of follicular cells. Now, the transition between the primordial and the primary ovarian follicle is due to local growth factors within the ovary itself. The primary ovarian follicles then transition into secondary ovarian follicles. A secondary ovarian follicle contains a primary oocyte surrounded by multiple layers of granulosa cells. Granulosa cells have receptors for follicle-stimulating hormone. The granulosa cells, when stimulated by follicle-stimulating hormone, can secrete estrogens. The primary female estrogen is called estradiol. The estrogens are produced by granulosa cells from androgens. The cells forming the outermost covering of this follicle produce the androgens. These androgens then move inward to the granulosa cells. The granulosa cells can then take those androgens and convert them into estrogens. The secondary ovarian follicles then transition into tertiary ovarian follicles. In a tertiary ovarian follicle, the granulosa cells begin to secrete follicular fluid. This liquid pools within the follicle wall and develops into a fluid-filled cavity called an antrum. Because of the presence of an antrum within both the tertiary and mature ovarian follicles, they are often referred to collectively as antral follicles. Normally, only one tertiary ovarian follicle completes the last transition into a mature ovarian follicle. This follicle is called a dominant follicle, and it has the ability to sequester follicle-stimulating hormone, while none of the other follicles in its cohort can. It is the mature ovarian follicle that is going to rupture and ovulate, meaning it releases the new secondary oocyte. The second meiosis II, the transition between primary oocyte and secondary oocyte, occurs within the mature ovarian follicle. So it is the secondary oocyte of this mature ovarian follicle that is ovulated. The remnants of the mature ovarian follicle in the ovary become changed into something called the corpus luteum. Now, the corpus luteum is not part of folliculogenesis, but I am including it here because it's shown as a little yellow lumpy thing at the bottom of the ovary. The corpus luteum is a temporary gland inside the ovary that has the ability to produce hormones. It produces progesterone, which is the main hormone it produces. It also produces a little bit of estrogen, also the hormones relaxin and inhibin. Now, if pregnancy does not occur, the corpus luteum will degenerate at the end of your cycle into a structure called the corpus albicans, which has no function. And eventually the corpus albicans will be broken down completely. The female reproductive cycle involves two distinct cycles. The first is called the ovarian cycle. The ovarian cycle consists of the monthly series of events in the ovaries that occur during and after the maturation of an oocyte. The ovarian cycle is controlled by hormones from the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. The menstrual cycle is the series of changes that occur in the endometrium of the uterus to prepare it for the arrival of a fertilized ovum. The menstrual cycle is controlled by hormones produced in the ovary. Now, the endometrium is the inner vascular lining of the uterus, and the endometrium has two layers to it. The functional layer is the layer closest to the uterine cavity, and this is the layer that is lost monthly and is then repaired and replaced during the next cycle. The basal layer is the deepest layer of the endometrium, and this is the permanent layer. This permanent layer is going to be used to rebuild that functional layer each cycle. So now let's talk about the ovarian cycle. The average ovarian cycle is 28 days long. However, the ovarian cycle can be less than this. There are some women with 21-day cycles. It could be longer. There could be a woman with a 31-day cycle. The differences in length are due to the differences in the length of the follicular phase, the first phase of the ovarian cycle, from woman to woman. Now, we will be basing our discussions on the average 28-day cycle. So the follicular phase in an average 28-day cycle extends from day 1, which is the beginning of menstruation, through day 14, which is the day of ovulation. The cycle begins when the hypothalamus, on day 1, releases gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which travels down to the anterior lobe of your pituitary gland and stimulates your gonadotropic cells. Your gonadotropic cells, in response, release follicle-stimulating hormone and, to a lesser extent, luteinizing hormone. The follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates continued growth of the ovarian follicle cohort and stimulates granulosa cells of the antral follicles to produce estrogens, the main female estrogen being estradiol. Estrogens have many functions in the female body. They help to develop and maintain female sex characteristics. For example, they encourage female body hair development. Estrogens are going to be responsible for the numbers and locations of female adipose deposits. They're involved in breast development. They're involved in creating female-related skeletal changes, such as the widening of the pelvic girdle, and the development of female vocal pitch. Estrogens do stimulate bone and muscle growth, but not to the same extent as testosterone in males. Unlike testosterone, estrogens do lower blood cholesterol, which does help to decrease the risk of heart disease in women up to about 50 years of age. Estrogens also affect central nervous system function. They do program the hypothalamus so that gonadotropin-releasing hormone is produced in a female release pattern. It also programs in the hypothalamus the female libido and other sexual-related behaviors. Now, in the ovary, estrogens are going to cause upregulation of follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and estrogen receptors in the dominant follicle. Now, moderate levels of estrogens are going to inhibit gonadotropin-releasing hormone. This leads to a decline in follicle-stimulating hormone production by the anterior lobe. Now, the loss of follicle-stimulating hormone causes most tertiary ovarian follicles to degenerate, but not the dominant ovarian follicle. The dominant ovarian follicle underwent upregulation of follicle-stimulating hormone receptors, meaning this follicle is more sensitive to follicle-stimulating hormone. So even though FSH levels are extremely low, this follicle has absolutely no trouble binding enough of it to maintain its stimulation. As estrogen levels continue to climb, the high levels of estrogen have a different effect on the hypothalamus. High estrogen is going to stimulate your hypothalamus to begin releasing GnRH again, however, with a different release frequency. And this different release frequency causes the anterior lobe to produce primarily luteinizing hormone. There is a small amount of FSH being produced, but primarily luteinizing hormone. ovulation is going to occur typically on day 14 of a 28-day cycle. And in the days leading up to day 14, there is a positive feedback cycle run by the estrogens and luteinizing hormone. As estrogen levels increase, it triggers an increase in luteinizing hormone production. The increase in luteinizing hormone production causes an increase in estrogen production. The further increase in estrogen leads to a further increase in luteinizing hormone. And this positive feedback cycle leads to what is called an LH surge. And the LH surge occurs just prior to ovulation. And you can see the LH surge shown on the graph below. This LH surge causes the completion of meiosis I and the formation of the secondary oocyte, meaning you now have a mature ovarian follicle. This LH surge then causes that mature ovarian follicle to ovulate, meaning it's going to rupture and release the secondary oocyte from the ovary. Now, some women might actually be able to feel this happen. The rupture of the follicle does cause a small amount of bleeding on the surface of the ovary, and this can create pain. This pain, which is due to the bleeding at the ovulation site, is called Mittelschmerz. After ovulation, we shift into the second phase of the ovarian cycle, which is called the luteal phase. The luteal phase extends between days 15 through 28 of the ovarian cycle. The high levels of luteinizing hormone after ovulation cause the remnants of your mature ovarian follicle to form a corpus luteum. It also causes the corpus luteum to begin secreting its hormones, the primary of which is called progesterone. Now, the role of progesterone is to help prepare and maintain the endometrium with the help of the existing estrogens, and also help to prepare the mammary glands for possible lactation. The corpus luteum does produce low levels of estrogens. It produces inhibin, which helps to inhibit FSH secretion. It also produces relaxin. Now, the function of relaxin in humans has shown to be much different than in other placental mammals. In humans, it helps to assist in creating the vascular changes within the placenta, in addition to other cardiovascular changes necessary in the mother. Alright, so now we have a corpus luteum. Your progesterone levels are increasing quickly. Estrogens being produced to a moderate level. You've got inhibin being produced, and all of these hormones are going to be heading up to the hypothalamus. And progesterone, most importantly, with the help of estrogen, is going to inhibit gonadotropin-releasing hormone production. Now, if you're not producing GnRH anymore, the gonadotropic cells in the anterior lobe of the pituitary also stop producing luteinizing hormone and FSH. And you also have the inhibin coming up and helping to turn off the FSH production as well. So by turning off the anterior lobe, you've got luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone levels dropping drastically. Now, if there is no fertilization, the loss of luteinizing hormone causes the death of the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is going to undergo a process called involution. The gland sort of collapses into itself. And when it does, it forms a non-functional corpus albicans, kind of a waste product. Now, the good thing about the loss of the corpus luteum is that you lose the progesterone, you lose the estrogens, you lose the inhibin, you lose the relaxin. And all of these hormone levels plummet, which you need, because the loss of the progesterone, the loss of the estrogens, allows for your hypothalamus to produce gonadotropin-releasing hormone and begin day 1 of the next ovarian cycle. Now, if there is fertilization, we don't want to start a new ovarian cycle. We want to kind of suspend the one we have. Well, if there's fertilization, the embryo actually starts to secrete human chorionic gonadotropin. Now, HCG actually helps to maintain the corpus luteum. So even though you've got your no luteinizing hormone, because that has declined, the HCG is going to keep the corpus luteum nice, healthy, juicy, fully functional. And it's going to keep that corpus luteum fully functional for the first trimester of your pregnancy until the mature placenta can actually take over the endocrine functions and produce its own progesterone, its own estrogens, its own inhibin, and its own relaxin. Now, the menstrual cycle is going to be controlled by the hormones estrogen and progesterone as they're generated during the ovarian cycle. Now, as you can see at the top of this graph, you can see that estrogen levels dominate during the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle, while progesterone is the dominant during the luteal phase of your ovarian cycle. So now, we're not going to start at day 1. We're actually going to start at days 4 to 15. Day 4 to 15 is what is called your proliferative phase. And the proliferative phase is caused by the estrogens that are being produced by the ovary and all of those developing ovarian follicles. Now, these estrogens are going to encourage the rebuilding of the functional layer of the endometrium. They're also going to stimulate the endometrial cells to produce progesterone receptors. So it's going to make your endometrial cells more sensitive to progesterone. At the end of the proliferative phase, your menstrual cycle transitions into what is called the secretory phase. The secretory phase runs through days 15 to 26, and it's run primarily by progesterone. And the progesterone at this time is being produced at very high levels by the corpus luteum. Now, the progesterone is going to cause the endometrium to grow in thickness. In fact, the functional layer reaches about 5 to 6 millimeters in thickness. As the endometrium grows in thickness, its endometrial glands are going to grow. They become wider, longer, more coiled, and they begin to secrete a lot of very nutritious glycogen, which is going to serve as an energy source for that embryo that's going to implant in the functional layer. And it's going to serve as that energy source until the placenta is fully developed. Also, the connective tissues associated with the endometrium are going to start to swell with interstitial fluid. At the end of the secretory phase, we're going to transition into what is called the premenstrual phase. Now, we are going to assume that no fertilization has occurred. And at around this time of days 27 to 28, the corpus luteum has died, and there's been a loss of progesterone. And the loss of progesterone actually causes the functional layer of your endometrium to begin to degenerate. As it degenerates, its arteries are going to constrict so that you completely lose blood flow to the functional layer. This is going to cause extensive tissue necrosis. The tissue is just going to die. It's also going to cause a cramping sensation as a result. The necrotic tissue, in addition to blood and serous fluid, are going to form the menstrual fluid. Now, after the premenstrual phase, we begin days 1 through 5, and on day 1, you enter what is actually called the menstrual phase. The menstrual phase is when the menstrual fluid is actually discharged from the vagina. Usually this occurs when enough menstrual fluid has accumulated within the uterine cavity. Overall, in one menstrual phase, the average female loses about 40 milliliters of blood and about 35 milliliters of serous fluid.